Now, one thing you've mentioned to me in our conversation is that the ground game is really important to be successful. And when I reflect on some of the most recent elections, we've seen some candidates completely give up on Iowa, throw up some billboards, throw up some ads, and they don't even come. And so, how is that going to change or even start becoming more prevalent as we go into the next election, especially with what's happened here with our first in the nation status?
It's certainly true that usually a strong ground game is important if you're going to win the Iowa caucuses, but we have had instances where people have skipped it. John McCain is a famous example that he ran twice, and both times he basically skipped Iowa. The first time he ran, showed up in Iowa for the two debates that were held here before the caucuses. The second time, he basically said, no, I'm not going to win in Iowa, so I'm not going to spend my time there. So he focused on New Hampshire and states down the road, and it proved to be a successful campaign strategy for him in terms of getting the nomination, though, of course, he lost the election. More recently, Donald Trump in 2016, again, because he wasn't a politician, he had a different style. He also was a much more highly recognized person. He had that name recognition that most candidates don't have, plus the resources to back it up. And so he didn't need to have that ground game. And during that whole campaign, I was saying, well, he's not doing it. He's behind in this ways. Well, ultimately it proved successful for him. For other candidates, they're not going to be able to do that. Again, Trump was kind of a one-off, a very unusual type of situation in terms of who he was and how he was able to run a successful campaign here in Iowa, and at least in 2016 in terms of the general election. Normally, though, unless you have somebody that has extremely high name recognition, they would need to win Iowa, at least, they would need to come in with that strong ground game. And basically get those supporters to be able to get them to show up to a precinct caucuses. Now, again, if the Democrats are moving away from a caucus, they have to have a caucus because that's what the Iowa law says. There's not going to be a primary. But if they change how the caucus works, if they just end up mailing every Democrat a preference card or something like that, they're going to get a vote. And they'll certainly find out who those particular voters support. But in terms of the depth of the energy behind it, it's just not going to be there. And I think it's going to be a problem, like I said, in terms of the Democratic Party going forward, whereas the Republicans, if they're still out there basically talking to people in the local towns, the small towns, rural areas all across the state to try to get their people to show up for their caucuses, it's going to perhaps convince more people, particularly those no party voters, to, hey, join our party.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of different formats of this campaign technique take form. For example, the Iowa State Fair is one that stands out the most to me. Now, when candidates come here to Iowa in the next year or so, what is going to be their biggest hurdle here?
There's there's no particular hurdle that's unusual for 2024 in terms of campaign in caucus in Iowa. This is particularly true for Republicans because, again, they're going to have the caucuses like they normally would. So they're still going to have to do the things that a Republican candidate would normally come into. Sort of the external factor, of course, is the fact that Donald Trump is a former president and has that huge name recognition, has a base of supporters, many of whom are basically going to say it's Trump or nobody as far as they're concerned, because they see him as this non-establishment outsider type of person, which they like, which is why they supported him the prior to presidential elections. So they're maybe going to stick with him. But the question is whether any other candidate can peel off some of those supporters and get them to join their campaign, whoever it happens to be. For the Democrats, it's unclear what's going to happen. And maybe that's the problem or the obstacle that faces them, because we don't know exactly how the Democrats are going to run their caucuses. If it's going to be a mail-in campaign, I think there are going to be some problems along those lines. Who are they going to mail the cards to? Do people have to request the cards, or is everybody just going to be sent, every registered Democrat just going to be sent one? What about people that register late for the Democrats? How are they going to get their preferences counted? So there's a whole variety of issues that are going to go into it that basically makes it all a big question mark at this point. And so that can be a problem. Now, having said that, again, if Biden does decide to run for re-election, and if nobody challenges him, it gives Democrats an opportunity to work out any problems in the system without it really meaning a whole lot, meaning that, Biden, with Biden unchallenged, he's going to get the nomination. Then we'll see what happens in the general election, depending on who the Republican nominee is.